us 3.5 hours, which seems like a long time, but we have a lot of information to cover. We also have with us the Inspector General of New York State, Inspector General Joe Fish. Welcome, and his top staff, his counsel Nelson Scheingold, and the Deputy Inspector General Kelly Donovan, and they will be reporting to us later on at the meeting in executive session. So I'm sorry that we're going to be keeping you here, but we have about an hour and a half, possibly more, of business to cover before we're able to go in executive session. So hopefully we'll keep you interested, because I think a number of the matters will be very interesting. One of the reasons that we do have so many people here and that it is important for us to stick with our agenda is that we have a serious matter pertaining to changes in our regulations dealing with an issue regarding partial match that has been discussed and debated here on the Commission for about the last 1.5 or 2 years. So that matter is very important, and we are going to have considerable discussion about that. So I do want to stay on schedule. I'd like to begin going around the room and on video and asking the members of the Commission to identify themselves so we can make sure that we do have a quorum. I'm Denise O'Donnell, the Commissioner of DCJS. And Bill?
Bill Fitzpatrick, the Onondaga County DA.
Okay.
I'm Barry Schechter, law professor, and my colleague Ivor Tolbert are not on the list to get up. I hope that's not a conspiracy.
You were not on the list?
We were delayed, so I apologize for being late, but we were on the
I was on the list, but I was Nora Fitzpatrick, so don't feel too bad. I'd rather have not been on the list.
So is Peter cleared, Barry?
No, Peter has an Achilles, ruptured Achilles tendon.
Ivar is cleared?
He's coming in, yes.
He's somewhere.
Okay, great.
Ann Willie, Wadsworth Center, New York State Department of Health.
Commission members?
Peter McQuillan, Office of Court Administration.
Harry Corbett, Superintendent, New York State Police.
Richard Jenny, Wadsworth Center, New York State Department of Health.
Okay, and at DCJS? We have
Jim Murphy, Saratoga County DA.
Jim? And then Onondaga County?
That's Kathy Corrado from Onondaga County, representing the crime lab directors.
Okay, great. And we have Ivar Goldard,
Yes.
who apparently was left off the list to get in the building.
Don't take it personally.
And we will take care of that. You have my apologies.
Oh, no.
Okay, thank you very much. The first item of business is a review of the meeting agenda, which has been provided to you 30 days in advance of the meeting. So could I have a motion to approve the meeting agenda?
So moved.
A second? Any objection? Okay, the meeting agenda is approved. The next item is approval of the minutes for September 22nd, 2009. Those minutes have been distributed prior to the meeting. Are there any additions or corrections to the minutes? Yes.
Point of clarification, page 3, third paragraph, with reference to the New York State Police lab system. It stated that there were no corrective actions found in the surveillance report. In fact, there were no deficiencies, so perhaps better stated or more accurately stated, there's no corrective action request were identified in the surveillance report.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that correction. Are there any other corrections?
I might just correct the spelling of my name in all of the documents. I don't have an E on my name.
Well, that's important for us to correct. Okay. Anything else? Okay. May I have a motion to approve the minutes of September 22nd, 2009? Motion?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Any opposition? All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Okay, the motion to approve the minutes is carried. Okay, we're next going to move to the laboratory updates. They are all updates. None of them require action by the Commission, but we are going to review them. They are, for the most part, reports from AskLab Labs about surveillance surveys that are done as part of the accreditation process. So they're mid-cycle reviews of the various laboratories. The first item, and is Kathy there? Kathy Levine?
Yes,
Okay.
I'm here.
Kathy, would you mind going through these for us?
Of course, not at all. Not at all, I don't mind.
Okay.
The first one is from Nassau County. It's just a request for an extension for 6 months for their AskLab Legacy program. The laboratory has applied for the international program and has an inspection date of December 14th through the 17th. And they just need the extension to cover that period of time until they get their results, until they have their inspection and get their remediation, if necessary, taken care of. So it's just a formality, no vote required on that.
Okay.
Any questions regarding that? Next up is just an update on the New York State Police Laboratory System. You saw their surveillance inspection at the September meeting. The letter you have dated on November 4th is just a letter from the American Society of Crime Lab Directors formalizing that their inspection is complete and that they have conformed to all of the AskLab International Accreditation requirements. The next item is the New York City PD lab. It's the same issue. You saw the surveillance assessment in September, at the September meeting. The November 4th letter is just formalizing that they are recommended to continue accreditation. The next laboratory is the Onondaga Laboratory. This surveillance inspection is the first time you're seeing this. There are no issues, no corrective actions are required, and they continue to be in conformance with the AskLab International requirements. Are there any questions on that inspection? And then the last laboratory on the updates is the Suffolk County Office of the Chief Medical Examiner Toxicology Laboratory. That inspection, you did see, but you did not see the letters that are included in your packet. And this is a mid-cycle review, so there is no vote required. But were some issues noted, and the laboratory was requested to provide some information about how they deal with false negatives in their proficiency testing program. But they continue to be in compliance with their accreditation requirements from the American Board of Forensic Toxicology. And if there are specific questions regarding any of the letters or the also documentation they gave to ABFT, I believe that the Assistant Laboratory Director, Mike Katz, might be in New York City and could probably answer those.
Okay, because these were mid-cycle surveillance surveys, we didn't require all the lab directors to come. But if anyone feels that there are issues that we need to follow up with respect to these labs, we can do it. Dr. Jennings?
Yes, Kathy, your comment that the ABFT requested information on the false negatives. In fact, ABFT did not ask for reports. They acknowledged that it would have been nice for the laboratory to have included its investigations into PT errors, but in fact did not request submission and proceeded to continue the accreditation. It does beg the question of what are the consequences of PT errors under ABFT review. And I think that warrants discussion at one point.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for the clarification on that. You're right.
I do plan to take up the subject of quality review and quality assurance and PT testing as we review the Inspector General's reports later on today. But if anyone feels like they want to discuss it further now, we can do that, or we can do it later.
Well, just one additional comment. I do need to acknowledge, nonetheless, that the laboratory did follow up in providing that information to the ABFT.
They are here.
Okay, thank you.
Suffolk is here.
Okay, Suffolk is here if there are any questions. Okay, thank you for the report on those mid-cycle reviews. The next matter for new business is a letter from the New York laboratory directors requesting assistance from the Commission in seeking additional funding in support of our New York State laboratories. This is a matter that has been discussed by the Commission more recently on a number of occasions. We have seen from our various accreditation reports that there are issues that funding could resolve, issues with safety and health and staffing, etc. That being said, we know that the state has very little money and all programs are being cut. So I think there is a concern. Obviously, we have the National Academy of Sciences report that also addresses funding issues. We have frequently discussed these issues here in the Commission, and certainly the laboratory directors have discussed them as well. So we have a request, and I'd like to just open it up to get your comments and discussion. Writing a letter from this Commission saying that we need more funding for labs is not, I think, going to really produce the kind of results we need. So we need to really think about, I think, doing this not just on one occasion, but in a more global way. And I don't know if anyone has any thoughts or ideas about it. Yes, Dr. Willie?
I do note that the letter raises the issue that the forensic labs do not have the fee-for-service option that clinical labs or environmental labs have. There was an interesting press release that came over the DNA about how in the United Kingdom the investigating agency that requests forensic services from labs actually pays out of their budget. And it did talk about the negative impact that that might potentially have on forcing law enforcement to submit or request less analytical forensic work. So it wasn't necessarily a positive comment, but, and I appreciate that in our system the DAs get their budget largely from the same place that the county or local labs get. You know, it's all from the county, and a large part of that is all from the state or whatever. So it's not necessarily an alternative source of funding, but it's a cost accounting exercise that might be an option that, would, instead of doing, and I don't know that this is the case, instead of doing 20 samples, you do the one that law enforcement thinks is most important. You need to do the second one, but you don't have to do all 20 because they were all picked up at the crime scene. I don't know that that's what's happening, but I'm just offering it as something that might be considered. I do know that the Article 6 funding that goes to medical examiners' offices is not being authorized for any forensic services.
Yes, Judge?
Yeah, given the fund shortage, I'm surprised at the many proposals to expand the work of labs, taking DNA samples from all arrestees, not New York but other states, taking DNA samples from all homicide victims, taking DNA samples from all dead people, partial matching, etc. Could one put a hold on some of these proposals?
Dr. Corrado, I know you wrote the letter, so I just want to ask you if you want to speak.
Thank you. Yes, I do. A couple of issues. First of all, I would like to point out that what we're really requesting here is we are pointing out that our local laboratories are funded with local dollars, and we really feel that given the pressure that we have and the amount of things we have to do to meet a lot of these guidelines, right now we're facing a loss of funding locally as well as through our state grants, and we're asking if the state can kind of come up with some ideas for a stable source of funding. So not so much that we want to start charging people, but is there a way such as attaching fees to people that are incarcerated or things like that, that we could get some funding through the criminal justice system that would actually support the laboratories, perhaps through restitution or some other kind of fees. So that's really what we're looking for. And I think our concern is that a lot of the laboratories, my own included, have been faced with mandatory layoffs and reduced work hours. And, you know, that's certainly, I had to drop a discipline, and I know other laboratories their turnaround time is being affected because they have less staff. And I think unless we can come up with a more stable source of funding through the state that can help the laboratories, we're just in this downward spiral. And I think it's important that everyone thinks about that, because, you know, I know the economy is hard for everyone, but we're really faced with making decisions about can we work these cases or not, and can we keep this discipline or not. And I think that's something that we're just trying to bring to the attention of the commission.
Thank you. Dr. Jenny?
Well, there appears to be no short-term solution for the funding problems, but there are consequences to losing resources. Kathy, you alluded to some of them, and it's how laboratories are going to manage those consequences or those risks. Often in laboratories, when resources are compromised, it could be pointed out that quality is the first to suffer. I think it's important that laboratories do perhaps supplement this report with a request for additional funds with a report of actions taken to manage with what they currently have, to make certain that, in fact, errors aren't becoming more prevalent as a result of the poor funding.
I was wondering, I think it sometimes helps in these kinds of situations to be specific as to exactly what kinds of critical services are not going to be met. I mean, that I think if you could be more specific about what things you won't be able to do and do correctly, you know, that would assist those of us who strongly support additional funding and a steady funding stream from both the state and the federal government to make the case. So what specifically are you going to be unable to do that you're now doing?
Okay.
Would you like me to answer that for myself, or?
Well, for yourself and for the other labs, because I take it this is a request that comes from all the laboratories.
Yes, I think the issue is, and I will stress that, you know, as lab directors of accredited laboratories, we certainly are never going to compromise quality. I mean, that's always going to be our number one concern. So basically what happens is when we're losing funding, we're having to make tough decisions about what we can let go. So certainly it's not going to be quality, but for instance, in my laboratory, we had forced layoffs, and I had to just drop a discipline. So our question document section was one that we decided we just could not sustain that service anymore. I know there are other laboratories, and I don't know if Dr. Prinz is there, and I believe some of the Westchester laboratories, they were faced with possible layoffs or possible reduction in workforce. And basically what that's going to be is less cases getting done, because we're not going to compromise quality. It's going to be just the number of cases that can get completed in a certain amount of time will be less, given that we have less staff. The other concern we have, I think, is with grant funding, because the state currently funds a lot of our laboratories with our accreditation expenses, such as purchasing proficiency tests, paying for calibration of equipment, and also paying for our audits when ASCLD comes out or ABFT comes out. And so, you know, if we were to continue to lose grant funding in that sense, we might really be in dire straits. I mean, if we can't afford to buy proficiency tests, then we obviously won't be able to continue to do the work. And, you know, that's just a fact. So there are specific funding issues, mostly staff, but other accreditation issues that we are concerned if we continue to lose funding, we will not be able to sustain those things.
All right. Well, Jim, did you want to say anything? Jim Murphy? I thought you raised it.
I certainly understand Dr. Crowder's position, and I'm glad to hear certainly that quality would never be compromised, not that I would expect it ever would be. But from a prosecutor's perspective, you know, I'm sure Bill Fitzpatrick would agree with me that, you know, we rely on turnaround time to, you know, bring cases to court and to provide evidence to defense counsel so that we get pleas or trials or whatever, or in some cases, exclusions. So this deeply concerns me. I know we're all in the same boat relative to funding, but I'm not sure I know what the answer is, but I certainly see the problem.
Okay, well, I think because it's such a systemic issue, I'm going to ask that we get a group of people together who are willing to work on this, both establishing the need, establishing and coming up with some ideas about how we can stabilize funding, how we can prioritize funding, maybe tie some of the funding, as we have been doing, to quality assurance, look for continuing income streams to support the laboratories. So if you are willing to serve on that committee and work on these issues, please let me know, and we'll put that together.
I'd be happy to do it. As far as from the DA's perspective, and have others join me, that I'm willing to kind of take up the lead on that.
I'm willing to do that.
Okay.
I'd also be willing.
Well, would you send me emails?
Too many.
So
Sure.
if you send me emails, I'll put that together, and I would appreciate your efforts, because I think we can't just go every 4 months and take up the issue and expect anything to get done. So I think that could be really helpful.
Denise,
Yes,
can I just
Judge.
say, I don't think anyone should consider fees on convicted offenders as a funding source. It's never worked in New York or anywhere else.
Our fees are pretty high already in New York, so
There's
those of us who
a
are
large
working on reentry
indigent
don't really
offender
think
population.
that's the way to do it right now. But there may be other sources of funding that are coming into the criminal justice system that we have to try to tap. And I think also sitting where I sit and hear people coming in asking for funding, the laboratory community hasn't really been part of that process. Yeah. The Association of Counties come in on behalf of different groups. Different groups come in on behalf of themselves, the DAs or the defense bar, but the labs really haven't been doing that on a regular basis. So I'm not sure that everyone understands the need, and I think this group could help with that. So thank you very much. The next item on the agenda is the laboratory updates and reporting. These are compliance issues which the laboratories must report to Escalade Labs at the end of each year. It's a charge. What we did last year, and I think we're going to have to do this year, given all the items on our agenda today, is to ask all of you to go through it. And we will put it on the agenda for the next meeting to discuss in greater detail. But if you want any particular laboratory director to be at the meeting, the next meeting, so that they can answer questions about these quality assurance issues, these are issues that don't rise to the level of us referring it. They're remedial actions that have been taken at the various labs. And so we will have any lab directors that you feel are necessary to come and discuss the issues at our next meeting. And if you can let me know ahead of time any issues that you particularly want to focus in on, we'll put that down on the agenda. Okay. The next item, then, we are going to get to the old business, and that is, the first item of business is the partial match issue. And I believe that will take up quite a bit of our time here in discussion, and I wanted to try to do this in an orderly way. So I was thinking about how to approach this, and you can let me know whether you think it would work, because we have debated this quite extensively. We have a request by two speakers to speak. One is Phil Pulaski from NYPD, and the other is Lisa Friel, but I don't know if is Lisa here. I don't really see her here.
Lisa's going to be here.
She'll be here shortly. Okay. And I know we have a letter which I've circulated that we received from 4 of our commissioners voicing their strong objection to the partial match policy. So what I was thinking of is to try to have a discussion of 20 minutes, half hour, from those who oppose the policy, and then have speakers who support the policy speak about the policy, and then we will have our discussion, anything else that the commissioners want to raise, and go forward to a vote.
I have
Yes.
one problem, Denise, and that is that I don't think it's fair to say that we've had extensive debate on what has been put forward to us as this DNA data bank plan, okay? Now, putting aside the very strong objection some of us have as a legal matter, that the Commission does not have authority to release information on an indirect association. That is a simple legal question, and as you can see from our letter, we're thoroughly dissatisfied with that and find that a very troubling matter. But putting that aside, my concern is I don't think I even know enough from just looking at this implementation plan as to exactly how this is all going to happen. I'm fully satisfied that the DNA subcommittee and this committee has had a debate about the technical issue of how small the window has to be in order to make a determination that it is indeed a close relative that is the source of the quote-unquote indirect association. And I think they've done that well. But that's not what we have before us. What we have before us is a plan on not just what that small window ought to be to determine whether this is a close relative, but to me the more important issue, which is, well, what happens then in terms of how these things are going to be investigated by outside agencies. Nor do I see in here anything about the so-called offline data banks, who I guess technically are not part of the indices, but how those relate to the issues of indirect associations and whether any examination is going to be made of those. So I just really want to note for the record that there are many very important substantive issues which are not really the DNA subcommittee's job. They're our job in terms of how criminal investigations are going to be conducted in our state by outside entities and what controls, if any, are going to be had on those. None of which, frankly, I see in this, it's adverted to.
So you want to just get right
I just
to the
want to make it
discussion
clear,
of the
we haven't
policy.
had that discussion. We
Okay.
haven't.
So instead of having people speak for why they support the policy, why they don't, we really should start with the policy, go through it, and have that discussion.
Thank you.
Okay. Does everybody feel that way? You can get into the policy, go through it, and then if people want to speak for or against it, they can. All right. So we're going to go to the tab in the binder under Old Business. I think it would also be helpful is Barry Deuceman here too. Barry, could you join us? Bring a chair up here too, because we may need to draw on your technical expertise as well. I'll move over. Okay. Mackie, do you want to join us too? Well, you can bring a chair up here if you can fit. Okay. All right, so under the binder, we have a letter from the DNA subcommittee, which we can get back to following their review of the policy. As you recall, after this issue was brought up and raised with the commission, what we did was eventually, after considerable discussion, vote to ask the DNA subcommittee for their scientific and technical guidance in the event the commission decided to adopt a partial match policy. That went to the DNA subcommittee. They did do that process of reviewing what, in fact, if we were going to adopt a policy, we should do in New York. They provided us that information. That information was used in drafting the policy. Not really, the policy didn't really change, but our implementation plan and our regulation that would allow us to permit partial matching in the event the commission decided to do so. After those were drafted, they were provided to the DNA subcommittee so they could review them to make sure they're consistent with the scientific and technical guidance that they gave us for proceeding to do this. Now, also, I think it's very important to point out that this policy is strictly a policy to provide guidance to laboratories of what they do when the scientists inadvertently find a profile that they believe, or a match that they believe, not a profile, a match that they believe may be consistent with a relative. So we are clearly not talking about using our databases to do familial searching. That is not what is before us. This started because the FBI asked states whether they wanted to participate in releasing information when laboratory scientists did find what appeared to be a partial match, and whether one state could provide identifying information to another state when that occurred. So that's the issue that we're looking for, or looking to address, and we will at this point then review the DNA regulation, proposed amendments to our current existing DNA regulations that will be required in order to do this, as well as changes to the implementation plan. And I'm going to ask Gina Bianchi to do that, and also Barry and Marina were part of a subcommittee that worked on this with the DNA subcommittee, so if there are technical questions, they're here to address those questions. So Gina, do you want to go through the regulation?
Sure. We'll go through the reg first. There's some changes at the beginning of 6192.1, for instance, in B, J, and K.
You're going to need a microphone.
Okay. And those changes are not necessarily relevant to partial match. They're more to clean up the regs to make them more precise and more accurate and more compliant with definitions that the FBI is using. So if anybody has any questions about those.
Can you explain what just the numbers?
Yeah, B,
clean-up ones.
B,
Okay.
G, J, K, and then L is just changing the word term to phrase.
How do you say B is not related to the partial match policy that we're trying to impose upon the state? Why was that change made?
Barry, do you want to talk to exactly why it was made? B.
I think I don't have the original.
Well, the original is, I assume the original is in the black print.
Yes, it is. It was just to make it more.
I mean, just for the record, so we'll get to it, it would have read, the phrase casework DNA profile refers to the DNA profile of undetermined origin of putative perpetrator generated by the testing of physical evidence. And here it's changed to a DNA profile that is derived from biological evidence originating from and associated with the commission of the crime.
It's because the original one wasn't clear, and actually that one phrase didn't make any sense. The phrase casework evidence DNA profile referred to that DNA profile of undetermined origin or the putative perpetrator. It just wasn't clear. This was for clarification. And also, I think, to be more in line with the NDIS definitions.
It does have the appearance
and
of
also
broadening the applicable
physical
DNA
evidence.
profiles, but
And the other thing was the physical evidence in forensics refers to basically can be any type of evidence, and we really wanted to specify biological evidence.
so you would consider a swipe of a touch, of a fingerprint touch, as
Yeah.
biological evidence?
Sure.
Well, most biologists, because it has DNA in it, maybe it's biological, but it's hardly a biological specimen. It's
Well, if
an
it's-
environmental
Right.
swipe.
But for us, if it has cellular material, it's evidence.
Well.
And that's biological in origin.
That's why I don't like your substitution of biological evidence for every place where you used to say DNA.
Okay.
That was more to, I'm sorry,
No, that's okay.
that was more to replace physical evidence than other things.
Okay, so some of this was an opportunity to take what had come to us as recommendations to just clean up some of the definitions, and some of it is pertaining to the partial match. This was thought to be a cleanup provision, and so if folks have trouble with it, we can deal with
I
that.
assume that this language complies with, is in accord with Article 49B of the Executive Law, which of course supersedes any rule or regulation.
I
Any
think you can
Yes.
assume that.
I can assume that, okay?
I mean, I think the concern, it sure looks to me like the original definition here referred to a DNA profile that either comes from an individual of undetermined origin, an unknown person, right, or a missing person, or a putative perpetrator. And this is rewritten when it says originating from or associated with the commission of the crime. That, I mean, let's just be frank about what's going on here. That seems to now allow for indirect associations or partial matching or eventually familial searching. That's what the definition does.
Without question.
I mean, that's why you did it.
Question. I
Yeah.
don't agree with that at all. It's.
Well, I don't agree with that either, but it is.
I think it's much clearer
what
than
it is.
what
It
was previously there. On the biological evidence associated with the commission, originating from and associated with the commission of a crime. I don't know.
All right, well, we're not
What
going
would be clearer?
to, you can note your objections, and we'll just review what they are in terms of the changes. So let's proceed.
Same question as the K.
That was added because of the partial match.
Okay,
K.
so that's,
But that was also, yeah.
So you want to just review K?
Do you want to talk about the scientific aspect of K?
I mean, part of the reason why I'm doing this is it starts to show just how dramatically this commission is undertaking to change the law of the state of New York without legislative approval. When you go through these definitions and when you go through some of these procedures, you've written an entire...
Art, could you move that microphone closer? We can't hear you in Albany, Ivar.
Part of the purpose of going through this is not just nitpicking, because I don't enjoy nitpicking, but it is to demonstrate the magnitude of the change which is being brought to this commission as being consistent with the existing law, which it is not. And to represent K as being a cleanup is just an example of how misdirected I think this mission is, which could be easily directed to the legislature as opposed to extending beyond our powers.
Okay, Ivar, K was not represented as a technical cleanup.
I
It
thought
is
it was.
part of the DNA policy, and also we are adopting an amendment that adds language that allows us to do partial matching. So there are some numbers of paragraphs here. There may be as many as 15 that do actually set out the way and the procedures for doing partial match. So it's not being represented that we are tinkering here with anything. We are adding a new section to this policy. We are, and because I think people were trying to be so precise, they did take this opportunity to try to clean up some information that existed there that was outdated. And that may cause some confusion, but it was done for the purpose of clarification. And we'll try to make those distinctions. But anyway, K, if you want to just address the purpose of K.
If you see with K, we actually did retain the original definition in that last sentence, and we simply added some clarifying language.
And the clarifying language is added for the purpose of discussing other testing that is done. Okay?
Yeah, I just felt this was simply a rhetoric. I mean, I just thought the language was clunky, and so I tried to clarify it, make it read better, and make it clear what we were talking about. We retained everything that was in the original definition. If you see in that last sentence, it's still there. I just added additional information to be helpful.
Can I have the mic here? Well, I really, you have to be, it doesn't take, this is obviously an example of a genetic slippery slope. I realize we're making a record, so let me be a lawyer and read what this is so we can understand what we're talking about. Originally, Kay said, the phrase DNA profile refers to the list of alleles carried by a particular individual at a specified set of genetic loci. Okay? Now, consistent with all the other definitions and consistent with the statute that said that the purpose of the data bank is to have a hit either to a missing person or crime-to-crime hits because the same person, one person, left biological evidence in two different places, or there was a hit to a known offender whose profile was already in the data bank. Now, by this indirect association approach, we have to redefine the phrase DNA profile here to say the phrase DNA profile refers to, quote, a set of DNA identification characteristics which may permit the DNA of one person to be distinguishable from that of another person. Okay? Now, and then it goes on in the last sentence to say, for STR DNA profiles, it refers to the list of alleles carried by a particular individual or a specific set of genetic loci, which is just adding STR to the original definition. Right, Barry? Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, when you add the sentence, a set of DNA identification characteristics which may permit the DNA of one person to be distinguishable from that of another, you are opening up a vast number of ways in which DNA testing can be done of a biological evidence of the genome, whether it's through evidence of people having diseases, right? DNA profiles that are associated with diseases or other kinds of characteristics or even racial characteristics or ethnic characteristics is now permitted as a way of doing associations because you're doing indirect associations. And it is not, Commissioner O'Donnell, just limited to quote-unquote partial matches. This permits familial searching. This is familial searching. That's what indirect associations permit you to do. And not just familial searching, but searching by all kinds of other ethnic or disease characteristics or racial characteristics are technically permitted by this kind of definition. And that is exactly the kind of slippery slope that has to be avoided, and this is sloppy.
Okay. The next change is Q.
Is the addition of the phrase forensic DNA profile refers to a DNA profile that is derived from biological evidence originating from and associated with the commission of a crime, which is similar to the casework DNA evidence profile because casework and forensic are used sort of.
Which number are you on? Sorry.
R.
Okay. I said.
She's
okay.
a
Oh, Q.
Q is
okay.
just.
Well, it was just to add the term DNA and in CODIS.
Okay, and R, you covered. Okay.
S is defining the phrase indirect association to refer to the determination during the CODIS candidate match confirmation process that a forensic index DNA profile is similar to a DNA profile in the convicted offender index or subject index, and a comparison reveals that the offender or subject may be a relative of the source of the forensic index profile. The term ELDIS is added to refer to that level of CODIS in which a public DNA lab maintains its DNA records for searching and uploading to higher level indices such as ESDIS and ENDIS. The term loci is defined to refer to the specific chromosomal locations or of genes or other DNA elements such as STRs. The term mitochondrial DNA testing or mtDNA testing refers to analysis of genetic polymorphisms that occur in the DNA of mitochondria. The next definition is the term ENDIS, which has a lot taken out of it, but it's just to refer to the National DNA Index System, which is what it is. The next two are just clarification of where the ENDIS exception standards are and that they were authored by the FBI. In Y, the term STR refers to short tandem repeat, and STR analysis is a form of testing which provides DNA profiles for loci which contain simple DNA unit repeats. STR loci on the Y chromosome are referred to YSTRs. The next is to, in the subject DNA profile, refers to a DNA profile generated by analysis, taking out the word testing, of a biological sample instead of DNA, and to just define what the term KSAT is, to clarify. And double B is the phrase unidentified human remains index, refers to the electronic database and CODIS containing DNA profiles generated from human remains of unknown origin. The implementation plan does allow for unidentified human remains, but there was nothing in the regs, so we thought that should be added to clarify. On page 4, under C, we've changed the term casework to forensic DNA profile to be more precise once again. Then we have changed in D, DNA profiles may be added to the DNA databank by forensic labs and include what types of profiles can be added, and we have included unidentified humans or human remains in that section, again, to comport with the implementation plan. They're at page 5 of the existing plan. E is where we get to the beginning of the actual indirect association partial match. And E is upon notification by the ENDIS custodian that all applicable ENDIS requirements have been satisfied, the division may release the name of an offender whose DNA profile has been indirectly associated through a national CODIS search with a DNA profile in another state's forensic index. Testing of additional loci of the offender sample may be required and may include YSTR and or mtDNA analysis. And that is for a national hit and search. And Barry, do you want to talk about that process a little bit?
And basically, the process involves a laboratory in another state having a casework DNA pattern that matches apparently to one of our offenders' DNA
I don't know.
patterns.
Are we getting background noise there?
Something's happening.
If we're getting some background noise, I don't know if anybody has something close to their microphones at our remote locations. If you do, okay, thank you.
Okay. What essentially happens is that the casework laboratory in the other state makes application to the FBI for the offender's name. And along with that application, they submit a confirmation that the prosecutor in the case is going to, in fact, continue with the case. And also they provide some statistical evidence that shows that, in fact, there may be a potential relationship between the perpetrator, the suspected perpetrator, and the offender. Each request, of course, is then reviewed by the FBI's general counsel and by the ENDIS manager. Once that review is complete, the FBI would notify the Department of Criminal Justice Services, make notification asking for release of the offender's name. If we determine the information can be released, we then release that name to the FBI, and the FBI will then supply it to the casework laboratory in the other state.
Yes, Judge. Mm-hmm.
Very briefly on F, not by the wildest stretch of the legal imagination can it be said that F comports with 49B. In a nutshell,
Okay, but we haven't gotten to F yet, right?
No, we're on E.
But you,
Well, E and F, they're
okay, well, let's go through F, and then let's talk about it.
Okay.
Before
Because,
we leave
okay.
E, I recall that there was some sort of, in the application process, the DCJS, there had to be an assurance from the local prosecutor that they would continue the prosecution or whatever the entity was that
Yes.
was in. And that there had to be an agreement, is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Who does that?
The FBI.
The FBI does that. And then they hand us the document or not?
I mean, once we release, I mean, they have to meet the FBI's protocol in order to
requesting
request it.
agency, yeah.
Yes, in
Okay.
order to request the identifying information from us.
What do we do? What does the state of New York do?
Once we get the assurances, we release the name of the individual.
Do we know that the requesting individual understands our regulations and our law with respect to disclosures and things of that nature? How do we know that?
Well, the name is released to the laboratory in our proposed regulation. So it's a question of how well informed the laboratory is to to make that application.
For in-state, but right now we're
Not
talking about the
national.
FBI.
No, but I was talking about
Yeah, the
what
FBI.
we're going to do.
No, I'm talking about what we're going to do for an out-of-state
Oh, I'm
person.
sorry.
I'm sorry. Yeah,
Okay.
That's okay. I wasn't too clear. Are we going to have any assurances that our internal policies of the state of New York are going to be carried forward by the requesting, and let's call it the receiving agency? Do we know that, or we just got? Does the FBI know it? What our policies towards redisclosure and things of that nature are going to be adhered to? Is that provided for?
Well, our policies are consistent with the FBI policies, so the FBI policies require those assurances in terms of the laboratory or the investigating agency, as well as the explanation to the investigating agencies that this is only a partial match. It's only an investigative lead. So I think, Steve Hogan, you raised
Just
your
to
hand.
follow up, whether it's a traditional hit or something like this, a use and dissemination agreement with the person who receives the pedigree information is required, whether it's Nebraska or Anchorage, Alaska, or anything else. May not be enough for you, but that's part of the procedure.
Could you explain what that is? What is a use and dissemination agreement?
It's a Miranda warning to the lab about the sensitive nature of what's being passed on to them, and an alert to the relevant regulations and stuff. We could get you the details at another time to see if you feel like it makes you comfortable, but it's something that's part of the disclosure in every single case and would be part of the disclosure here.
All right, let's go with Nebraska just as an example. Nebraska's made this request, they've agreed to everything. Can they go to someone and say, look, we want to talk to you because your Uncle Fester has DNA profile in New York State, and the profile we lifted from this crime scene is similar? Do you envision that being possible?
I would think so. That's the FBI protocol for release of partial match that they've been working on, and they recently updated with Swigian. So that information would be passed on as an investigative lead to law enforcement out there. Yeah, that's the vision of how this would happen.
And then that would become the currency of the investigation should they need judicial intervention or some method to reach this relative.
They would look at, in the same way as we would in a partial license plate or anything else, that they'd start looking at the uncle or the person of interest who was associated, talk to him, do whatever that they might otherwise do. There's a whole variety of ways of pursuing leads that law enforcement people do. So that's the focus of the investigation would certainly turn to that individual in Nebraska who's related to the convicted offender.
But don't you think that the individual in Nebraska is going to come to his attention as to why the police are at his door that particular day? And would that in some way create a problem for our disclosure issues?
I mean, it's a fair question, Ivar. I don't know whether, as a matter of tactics, the police officers would necessarily give that information out as part of their conversation, or whether they would pursue a control sample any number of ways. I can't say how it would be done on the other side. But if the officer knew where that came from, you can assume that that's part of the thing that the officer knows when he deals with the uncle, in working that investigative lead.
But you're saying uncle. How do we,
Well, I think
No, but there's somebody in the New York State system, okay, who is indirectly associated with a sample. But, the difference here, I take it, is that when you get a hit to an individual, right, you then go and look for that individual following traditional law enforcement means. Whether you go out and get a warrant, or there are traditional ways of going about it. That's not what's going on here with an indirect association. What's going on here is, let's take Sheriff Joe Arpaio, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, in Phoenix, who is notoriously vigilant with respect to immigration problems. In terms of the way this system works, there is nothing that would prohibit him from saying, I have biology from a recent person who I have reason to believe is unlawfully entering the United States out here in Arizona. And then there's an indirect association to, maybe it's more than one person, to individuals that are in prison in New York who originate from Binghamton or the South Bronx or Brooklyn or any of that. I take it there's no restriction here as to the kind of crime that could be subject to this indirect association, nor is there any requirement that anyone in New York State know of exactly how Sheriff Joe Arpaio may be going into any of these jurisdictions with individuals carrying guns to investigate the families of people who have individuals in prison in New York. There's nothing here for that, right?
Yes, that's the way we've done this for the last bunch of years when we do interstate CODIS hits. The only difference being that one is a direct and the other one is related. But beyond that, we don't control much of what happens in Arizona.
But we do control a lot of the steps that are taken to increase the likelihood that it is a brother as we get into the policies.
Right,
and then it is an investigative lead. We've always talked about that. It's an investigative lead, but it's an investigative lead based on considerable scientific inquiry that this is actually a relative, and we don't know until we follow through in the investigation. So,
but my point, and I take it to not disagreeing, but my point here is that adequate thought and has not been given at this point, and I'm sure our law enforcement friends can give us some guidance in this regard, and I'm sure Phil Pulaski has some answers as to how ordinarily you would go about doing this. But my point is, there is a world of difference between getting a hit to a specific individual where we know how to go find them, right? We know how to go get warrants for them if they are, we say, this person has committed this crime because the biology links them, and something that is an indirect association to one or more family members that I'll grant are close relatives. And yes, it's an investigative lead, but it is a completely different kind of investigation. Now, the reason that I'm focusing on this is that I want this to be clear as a bell, that I support and have supported from the beginning, having legislation that mirrors what is done in California, for example, where this kind of, whether you want to call it partial matching or familial searching, is only done in cases of the most serious kind, right? A designated group of cases, where they're the ones that you cite, Denise, which everybody is understandably concerned about, serial rapist or serial murderer, that all other investigative means have been exhausted, and that the least intrusive investigative means are going to be used to find that individual, and that we here in New York State know what Sheriff Joe intends to do, that he has to, in some fashion, notify us, and that a judge supervises it. Now, something like that, I think, is an excellent legislative fix that I think we all should support personally. I'm speaking only for myself. I'm not speaking for any others. And I think a lot of civil libertarians would support something like that. But the problem here, and my real objection to it, is that this is not a trivial matter. There is a huge difference between having a hit to an individual that you can issue a warrant on because they've committed a crime, and an indirect association for any kind of crime that can get into CODIS, right? And then having people come into New York State with little notice to us, no required notice to us, as to exactly how they're going to go about searching communities. We have enough problems with out-of-uniform individual with guns, whether they're undercover officers or anyone else, shooting each other. All right? I mean, there's a whole host of problems that could arise, and I don't think it's addressed here.
okay. I do think one of the things that we're talking about is a very small number of cases. How many are the FBI finding at this point on partial match? Do you know?
In 3 years that this has been in place, they've had 11 requests throughout the country, and we've never had any here in New York State.
But when we get to our plan, we're also going to see that one of the things the DNA subcommittee requires is that every case be reported back to the DNA subcommittee, and we will require it as well to this commission. So we are going to be able to see each and every case and follow what happens. If this is the horror show that you're talking about, which I really don't believe is the case, then we can take action immediately. but to tie everyone's hands and make a regulation so tightly drawn that it will be nearly impossible to effectuate is not, in my view, the way that we should be going. Anne?
Can I ask a question regarding this estimate of numbers? Right now, when there's crime scene evidence developed, and it's developed with all the QA and the lab and the certification, it goes up through the chain for matching against the national database. Because of the stringency criteria that are set in the matching algorithm, the number of potential matches that might be in that database are limited to the probability that there really is the same person in that database. And so the number of hits, direct matches, is limited. It's limited to whether that person or their twin is in the database. As I understand the concept of a partial match, in order to identify a match where fewer than all the alleles at all the loci match, you have to reduce the stringency of your matching algorithm so that the computer now will not exclude all of those potentially linked profiles, so that the probability that you're going to see cases where there is this link, I'm picking my words carefully, is much, much higher statistically, because now the numbers of potential linked profiles is no longer limited by identity. It's limited by the allele frequency in the population of the individuals who've been tested as offenders and whose data is in the system. So that while there have been very few cases nationally where all of the stars aligned that finding out that there was a potential relative turned into a divulged case that we all hear about, the statistical likelihood that that the FBI, the national database, is going to be holding this very awkward situation of saying, well, I don't have a match, I can't identify an offender, but simply by biological probability, I have a greater likelihood that I'm going to find these less stringent similarities. And so I think we're talking about two different things. The probability that you're going to, in the end, having done this relationship thing and having done this backtracking to find out if there are even any relatives of this identified offender, that you're going to end up with a case in which it's valuable is limited. But the potentials, the number of times you're going to get told, oh, well, there are 10 offenders in the database, any one of them might have a relative. That's the way those cases get reported. So the actual number of cases in which it's a possibility goes way up. It isn't, you may exclude them through a process, but the potential numbers of offenders' families is high.
It would have the potential for going way up if we didn't control the information that we enter in terms of the number of loci that are present. We limit this to 10 loci or more. Okay, so we're very careful to control, because otherwise we would have the situation you were talking about. We'd have a lot of false positives. But right now,
even at 10 instead of the total match of 13, the data going in is limited in its quality. It has to be a single source profile, and it has to be a profile where you got results for at least 10 loci. I understand that. You're not putting partial profiles up to the database. But as I understand the statistical allele frequencies of the database, you're going to get lots of potential partial links.
The availability of all those loci allows us to titrate that, so we have achieved the balance.
Well, yeah, but it's going to be more than the number of direct links, and you keep saying it's going to be smaller than that number.
The number of direct, for example, last year in the database, the number of direct links that we get, which under high stringency searches, was 5,000.
Right.
The total number of moderate searches that we got, which is what we're talking about here, is 15% of that.
is what percent?
15% of that.
That makes no biological database sense to me.
I guess
It
there's some
should,
difference in
when
the
you
concept.
reduce the
because
stringency of the match, you should get more matches,
But
not
are we
fewer.
reducing the stringency of the match?
Yes.
we
you're
change the
al-
match
yes.
conditions so that we
To-
can see, yes, so we can see additional genetic information.
When I do a hybridization of DNA and I reduce the stringency, I get more hybridization, not less.
I think, may I say something?
Yes.
I think the issue is that you would be correct, I believe, if we were reducing the stringency and looking at all possible partial matches, but that's not the way, and Barry, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's not the way the software works. It's only a limited number of partial matches that'll filter through and come up as a hit. And it's because of the way the medium stringency works that the minimum number in one sample has to match another sample. If it were in any combination, that would be true, but it's not in any combination. It's only under certain circumstances.
Any combination
So
of 10.
the software is limiting the combinations that it will call a hit.
But it will still be more combinations than a direct match.
Basically, what we're doing is we're allowing one pattern to have more genetic information in it than the other. We're not really decreasing the amount of genetic information that we're comparing. We're just allowing one to have more. For example, in the case of a mixture, they'll have extra alleles, but we'll still
You're
see.
searching for a smaller needle in the same haystack. And since it only has to match a smaller amount of data points, you will find more of them, not less of them.
No, I can explain.
Okay.
I think, Anne, I see you are absolutely right. You'll get more family associations than 100% total matches. And we have software for the World Trade Center victim identification where we have 100% match and we have a whole list of family associations. The FBI software is not designed to find family associations. It can only find a moderate match for a single source if the other person is homozygous at this locus. And since a homozygous genotype is more rare in the population, I think Barry is correct, you get only a smaller percentage of these types of moderate matches to homozygous loci than the complete matches.
Yes.
Then that was a missing piece of information. It will filter the number. But now you're throwing away a whole bunch of potential partial matches.
They're not thrown out, they're not even detected.
But
the software
by
cannot
doing
do it.
that, what's the point of doing this? I'm sorry.
Because we. Go ahead. I'm sorry. I interrupt.
I think it's basically to help the criminalists in the laboratories that doing the candidate match resolutions, and they see something that is really close, and they cannot investigate themselves if this is a true family association or not, because the state is not allowed to give out the name and allow for any follow-up investigation. So we have to declare these a no match, which is correct, is true, even though we feel from our experience as scientists and geneticists, and we can confirm it through statistical analysis, that this actually might be a family member and it might be an investigative lead.
Yeah, one, regardless of how many you're going to get one way or the other, Denise, what you said before is, well, we're only going to have, 3. This is a very small number, right? And frankly, there's no guarantee that those are going to be on the kinds of serial rape and serial murder cases that is driving the desire of some to push this through. Well, if it's such a small number, why go through this process, frankly, of what in the judgment of many is obviating the need to go back to the legislature? Why do that, number one? Why raise what is going to be a political firestorm which is going to get in the way of efforts to increase funding of laboratories? I mean, I really do see, these things as being counterproductive. I mean, From my point of view, I mean, really, as somebody that wants to increase the efficacy of the databases, get more money for the laboratories, improve the quality of work, it is simply because this is dealing with such a small number of cases and yet raises so many concerns about going down that genetic slippery slope that it's ill-advised. And it really is a good idea to follow through with, frankly, a legislative solution with appropriate judicial oversight so we can evaluate these things, and it can be done in the least intrusive ways that I think would garner broad-based support not only from the law enforcement community, but from even some civil libertarians, and indeed not just deal with the partial match situation, but on limited occasions for the most important cases also allow for some kind of familial searching. And so I do think it's a problem, but just to go right back to what you're saying and why these proposed regulations are very different than anything we've previously discussed. We were just discussing the statistical problems before. The last group of people, frankly, within our system that are in a position to judge whether or not the subsequent investigation of an indirect association by another law enforcement agency, by Sheriff Joe or anyone else, it is not the DNA subcommittee. They're wonderful scientists. They have no competence or expertise to make a judgment about whether or not the investigative means of following up on indirect associations are appropriate. That's not what they know about. That's not what they were there. So these regulations, I think, are missing the point, and that is not a protection.
Okay. I have a response, but I think we're going to get there later. I think what Dr. Prince said about the inability of our scientists to be able to give out an investigative lead in a case where they believe strongly that this will lead to a relative is the reason that we're here, and why the firestorm should exist. I guess I just have to turn it back to you, because we made a clear distinction here with not pursuing familial searching. And while, again, many things could lead to that, we have not pursued that. And I think, you know, if you feel strongly against that, we certainly can take those issues up at a later time. But what we propose here today does not allow familial searching. It's confined to this issue that we're very, very concerned about. And in a significant case, it can be a serial murderer, it can be a serial rapist, to not allow our scientists to follow through on their clear instincts supported by scientific information that they have is what is troubling to us. So let's get through the policy and then we can discuss that in further detail. So we're on F, and then I know the judge wants to respond. So
now, F refers to the sequence of events that we envision for an in-state match. In this case, the laboratory with the casework evidence profile makes application to the Division of Criminal Justice Services for release of the convicted offender's name.
New York City, you're breaking up. We hear about every third word from Barry.
okay, in Albany, can you talk to our technical people, because we hear sounds of waves that are interfering as well. Yes.
Denise, maybe you can ask them to press the mute button until they talk.
Okay, that may help. Could you please press your mute buttons until you talk, both in Onondaga and in Albany, and that may help us. And then maybe you can hear us better.
All right.
Thank you.
So, along with that application to the division, the casework laboratory is required to provide several confirmations. The first one is that they have conducted a search of their local DNA index system. They also must confirm that the profile that is involved in the match is a single source profile having at least 10 loci. Those conditions are imposed for one of the reasons that Ann brought up, Commissioner Wiley, is to decrease the number of potential false positive matches. The laboratory must also certify that the prosecutor in the case has committed to further investigation, and the laboratory must agree to provide follow-up information to the state DNA subcommittee. That follow-up information should include the number of occurrences that have been detected and the outcome. They also must confirm that once the name is released, that they will generate a report to the submitting agency, and that report will indicate that this match is indirect, and it is an investigative lead, and it is not conclusive. Once that confirmation is received by the Division of Criminal Justice Services, they will provide the match information to the State DNA Data Bank, and the State DNA Data Bank will calculate and report whether or not the appropriate statistical threshold has been met, and then we will so advise the division, and we could also indicate to them if the threshold hasn't been met, we can recommend that additional testing be done. So upon receiving the completed application from the local participating CODIS laboratory and confirmation from the data bank that the threshold has been met, the name will then be released. If the subsequent testing that was recommended does not meet the threshold, the offender's name will not be released.
Judge.
Just refer back to the problem. The problem arises from the fact that 49B of our executive law was drafted 15 years ago, before the Brits discovered family matching and partial matching. That's the problem. Now, one quick thing on 49B, it seems to say rather clearly that a DNA record may be released in only two situations. One, when it establishes identification, and two, when it assists in the identification of specified human remains. No other situation is allowed. It doesn't permit the release of a DNA record when it assists in the identification of the perpetrator. Seems to me the solution, a rather quick one, is to take all these proposed amendments to the regulations, massage them, and put them in bill form and present it to the legislature.
Okay,
It's an easy solution.
I have a technical question here, and I don't see it. I'm getting a little lost on all these indices. We know that there are, how do you like to refer to them? There's offline databases. What's the term you like, Barry?
Offline databases is fine. We don't maintain one, so I really don't have a term for it.
All right, who has a
Local
you want to call them local databases? I call them offline or rogue databases. But these are databases that I understand have tens of thousands of profiles in them from people that are victims of crimes or suspects that were never apprehended. Now, are these local databases going to be searched in this fashion? Can you take profiles from those and search them? Are the laboratories themselves going to, are they doing it? Can they do it? Do these regulations even address these local databases?
These recommendations only address the databases that are in CODIS, and that's the local databases. Each laboratory has its own local CODIS database, which will have local forensic DNA evidence profiles in it.
No.
Casework profiles.
I'm talking about the tens of thousands of DNA profiles that have been collected outside of the CODIS system. Yes?
These only address the CODIS databases.
Right.
Eldest.
Well, but given the procedures, well, first of all, do you all know to what extent indirect association searches are being conducted of the local databases now?
I can speak for New York City. We do have a local database that contains about 6,000 suspect profiles. Many of those are arrested or confirmation samples that were obtained after a convicted offender had, but Barry is correct. Some of them are simply were subject of an investigation. We are not doing these type of indirect searches on these samples.
Do you know, does anybody know whether the other 7 local labs are doing those or in any way included here?
It's my understanding that only 4 of the New York State laboratories do have a suspect index, the way New York City does. But I do not know what type of searches are performed.
Excuse me, but Barry, whatever the practice may be, there's no statute, no regulation that prohibits.
Right.
Right. We brought that up. We don't
Something
regulate
doesn't
those
prohibit
labs.
it, it's
That's
permitted.
been the subject of case law. The courts in New York have upheld the ability of those laboratories to maintain those databases. We don't regulate them.
To lower
So-
courts.
I mean, let's not get into that again. But I'm only pointing out, and as the Judge McQuillan has just observed, that, and I had, on previous occasions, I thought that 8 laboratories actually had such, but be that as it may. There's nothing to prevent these kinds of indirect association searches being done on those databank samples. 0. And we're talking about the same places, right? Am I right? I mean, in other words, you have the same people in the same labs that are going through this system that is being proposed right now for reporting indirect associations, but the same people have their own database right there that contains samples from people that have not been convicted of crimes and even victims of crimes or relatives of victims of crimes, and those could be searched in the same way, and there's nothing to prevent it. So we're here talking about what the right public policy should be, and it seems to me that that is a serious problem. This end around, direct contravention of the statute and the release of more information through indirect associations is only going to upset people more, that a whole series of things that are being done, right, that are not just convicted offenders and not just crime scene samples, in the name of this commission, it is a serious problem. There's no regulation. We have no idea what they're doing. They could be doing all kinds of familial searching now. It's the same places.
I don't know if any of the lab's directors want to respond to it. The nefarious characterization of these databases is something that we've had discussion about. You believe they're nefarious. The laboratories believe that they're local samples that have been taken in over the years, that they can search first, that provides investigative leads to them. The courts have upheld that ability of those laboratories to keep those databases. So that is a subject we can continue to discuss, but
don't misstate me.
I think it's a different issue than what we're talking about here.
It isn't. We're talking about violating the strict and plain language of statutes. So that all I am pointing out here, and the reason I asked the question, and I still don't have any answers after 2 or more years of asking. Nikki gave us an answer as to New York City, but I don't know what the other ones are doing. But it's clear that there is no regulation of them. That what's nefarious is the lawlessness of this. I'm not saying that any of these individual laboratories or their people are necessarily doing anything wrong or personally like that, but I'm saying it is lawless. It is totally lawless. And when you just said at the very beginning, Denise, they're getting a sample from a crime and they're consulting their local database, I mean, what you've just said is there's biology from a crime scene, they're running against a local database that includes the husband of a rape victim, or somebody that was a suspect in a crime who eventually was found not to have committed it. That's what they can run it against. Those are facts. Whether you choose to regard that as nefarious or not, I don't know. But why isn't that true? That is true.
It's my understanding that none of the New York State laboratories have any victim samples or witness or elimination samples.
Well, they have suspect samples of people that were never arrested. You can call them that.
All right, but I do think we are getting off tangent in terms of talking about these databases. So, Dr. Willey?
Different issue. You speak to the point that this is not a deliberate familial search, that these are inadvertent discoveries. Okay? But in order to be able to calculate this relationship index, right, which is the criteria by which you're arguing you're limiting the number of times you're going to call this a likely relative, right? That's the step in the process that you think suggests that these are limited in number and inadvertent. It's the calculation of the statistical probability that this is a relative.
This is just a tool to establish the fact that there is a relationship there. It comes at the very end of the process.
Okay, then my question is, then I don't understand what in the defined process in the regs or the policy limits these less stringent, less than 13 loci matches, these mismatches, the identification of an offender who has alleles that do not match the crime scene. Right? I don't understand how you're limiting these to inadvertent discoveries versus a subset of the familial matches that get identified. I don't know how you call these inadvertent versus familial searches.
They're inadvertent because the search was never intentional to look for this type of relationship.
But the search is very intentional to match your 10 allele single source DNA profile against the state database. That is intentional.
Yes, the search was intended to reveal matches in mixtures from
Right,
victims
but
and from degraded samples.
But because you're allowing the computer software more leeway, it will now spit out to you the fact that there is a profile, not the name of the person, just that there is a profile. It probably gives you the profile, I assume, that is a less than, that actually is a mismatch. It has the 10 alleles, but it's got other stuff in there as well.
But Dr. Willey, they're already doing that.
Well, but
it's not something new that we're going to do under this policy. They're already doing that because they're searching for mixtures in cases of rape and sexual assault at moderate stringency.
But
so that's what's going on right now.
But they are then not releasing the identity of the offender in the database. So when you get these mismatches now, the name of the offender is not released, and all you know is it wasn't a perfect match, you don't have a hit.
Right, that's the problem.
No, I understand, but I don't understand how you can call these inadvertent and not familial matches. You are looking for persons who may have a relative. I don't
know. They're looking for the offender in a mixture case right now.
Well, I understand, but they are now going to release the offender's name when those, and now it won't just be mixtures, it can be a single source with 10 alleles rather than a mixture with multiple mixed up alleles matched against that database. But now instead of simply calling it no match and giving you no name, they're going to say, oh, we have these partial matches, it might be a relative. Is that, I mean, that's what I have trouble not calling this familial searching. And I'm not sure it matters what you call it, except to be honest, because you're going to be identifying families who will then be at risk.
We think we're being honest because this is a terrible piece of software to look for familial relationships.
I don't disagree, but you're going to find them now.
1 in 1,000 siblings would be detected using this software. I mean, it's not the software we use for familial relationships. It was designed and implemented for entirely different purposes, which we mentioned.
I don't disagree that it's bad software. I would argue that if anything, if you're going to argue you want to do partial matches to relatives, you should be changing the software and be doing this as a careful and appropriate and thorough statistical evaluation. I do think that's a public policy debate And that then feeds into Barry's argument. But I think, in effect, that argument defeats your argument.
But it doesn't
You're not
resolve-
using the best tool.
Right. But it
You're
doesn't
going to
resolve
miss a
our
whole
problem.
bunch
It
of
doesn't
these.
defeat the problem, the ethical problem of finding what you believe is a match in an actual case that's before you and not being able to release it.
Well,
So
we
it-
face those
Yeah, but-
ethical
But I
problems
do think
in
it's
lab.
important to understand because
I
I
do
think we
understand.
created, I know you do, but I think some of this discussion created the impression that now scientists are going to be able to do new searches at a different level of stringency in order to develop more partial matches. And they're not changing what they do as scientists in terms of how they're doing searching and what software they're using. It's when they come across this situation, will we give them the authority to be able to release that information is really the issue.
But-
So I'd like to turn now.
I just
Okay,
wouldn't call
Judge.
it, I wouldn't call it ethical. It's a problem, from your perspective, a problem with the legislation, which was drafted umpteen years ago, before this was known to be a possibility.
Okay, so I'd like to go through the implementation, changes to the implementation plan that are now required to put this policy in place. And they are also in your binder. Gina, can you go through those? And they are somewhat repetitious of the regulation.
They are. On Roman numeral, page 4, the term indirect association is defined to be a term referring to the determination during the CODIS candidate match confirmation process that a forensic index profile is similar to a DNA profile and the convicted offender index or subject index, and a comparison reveals that the offender or subject.
Gene, I'm sorry, where are you?
Roman numeral 4 in the implementation
Called
plan.
DNA Databank Implementation Plan. The numbers may be different.
The definition.
It's probably the first document you have.
Okay, yeah.
So the next change is not until page.
See, our pages are different, at least the page I have starts with 9. When you refer to the page number? Oh, you're not talking about
I'm
that.
talking about the implementation plan right there.
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, got it.
And then on page 3, this language is identical to the reg language. I don't know if you want me to read through it again. It's the same.
I don't think you have to.
Okay. It's exactly the same as what is in the regs. And then the final change, I believe, is on page 15. Which is a post-implementation action, and the existing language states that the DNA subcommittee shall conduct a post-implementation review to determine the effectiveness of the DNA databank in meeting the defined and implied objectives of Executive Law, Section 995. This review shall include, but is not limited to, determination of the use of the data generated from automated searches of the DNA databank, and then new language is added, evaluation of the results of the policy for reporting indirect associations that result from CODIS searches, needs for improved case tracking, evaluation of emerging technologies.
If you can put them on mute, we're getting noise. Okay. All right. Go ahead, Gina.
Evaluation of emerging technologies and determination of the needs for changes in reporting formats. Pursuant to 9 NYCR Section 6192.3, the indirect association policy will be subject to review every 2 years. DCGS will report to the DNA subcommittee any information received from investigating agencies regarding names released pursuant to this
We're going to
policy.
disconnect and reconnect on here because we can't hear. We're having technical difficulties.
Okay, would you please keep your phones on mute too, because we're getting the back noise here. Okay.
We are on mute.
Denise, I think what they're telling us is that we're going to have to disconnect completely and then reconnect.
Okay.
Because we can't hear you at all.
All right.
That was all the changes.
Okay. All right. I did have a request from Lisa Friel to speak. Lisa is the lead prosecutor in the Special Prosecutions Unit in the Manhattan DA's office. Sex Crimes Unit, sorry. And asked to speak about the issue. So if there's no objection, I'd like to ask Lisa to join us and to speak to us. And Lisa, I guess we have a seat for you down there.
Down here?
You don't mind?
No, not at all.
And thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for allowing me to speak.
I think she needs a microphone.
I have 3 teenagers in my house. I can talk fairly loudly without one.
Maternal training.
Okay. Let me start by saying that I have now been at the Manhattan DA's office for 26 and a half years, and I've been in the Sex Crimes Unit for 23 of those 26 and a half years, and 18 of them as either the deputy or the chief of the Sex Crimes Unit. And I only tell you that not to say that I can't find a real job, but to let you know that I have a huge amount of experience in this. And doing this in New York City, I've seen literally thousands and thousands of sexual assault victims in my career. And so I want to put this in a real perspective. It's been a very interesting discussion, and the science is very interesting, but I think sometimes we get away from what the reality of allowing this is going to be. And so I wanted to talk about that for a few minutes. We've heard people talk about that this poses a risk to the family members who will be investigated, or that it's being put in a context that this is an awful thing, that police officers might show up to the door and question different family members. The first thing I want to say is this presupposes that police officers and law enforcement officers do not show up at the doors of families in other contexts, because they have other kinds of investigative leads. And I'll put this in the context of a real case that I did some years ago. I prosecuted a serial sodomist, if you will, here in Manhattan. He would wait outside a shelter in the 30s. He knew it closed at midnight, and he also was aware that homeless women didn't always wear watches and didn't get there on time. And when they got there after midnight, they couldn't get in. And he would walk up to them, pretend to be a social worker, and offer to let them come back to his apartment, where he always said he lived with a woman, so they would feel safe and they could sleep on his couch, and he'd give them something warm to drink. And he'd take them to his office in the morning and help set them up with services and find them a better place to live. And at least 3 of the women he brought back to his building and anally sodomized in his stairwell reported it. I'm sure there were many more, given the population that he was attacking. It goes without saying this was devastating to all of them. You really have to understand from people who've worked with victims how devastating a sexual assault is. It ruins people's lives every bit as much as if you killed them. It really kills things in them and their lives going forward in many ways. In the course of this investigation back in the 80s, we had no DNA of any kind in the 80s. What the police did do was make a sketch. And Barry, I think you would be the first to say that making a sketch based on human memory, just like IDs have that vagary, is not the most reliable tool. And yet they made a sketch, and they took the sketch to the super of the building where this occurred. And the super of the building took a look at the sketch and said, that's one of the Harris boys. And so what did the police do? They went upstairs to talk to the Harris boys. If you don't pass these regulations, in effect, you're saying they can't go upstairs and talk to the Harris boys. So they went upstairs and they talked to the Harris boys. They didn't cuff all 3 of them. They didn't point guns at any of them. They spoke to them. They spoke to the family. They investigated the Harris boys. And in the end, they were able to identify with other evidence which of the Harris boys, Jerry Harris, committed these awful crimes. And I tried him, and he's doing 75 years right now. The partial match that I'm here to support allowing us to use as an investigative lead is actually a far more reliable way of going to see the Harris boys. It's not based on human memory or people's ability to articulate words into a sketch. We do similar things if you get an anonymous tip. The police are going to go to the Harris boys' apartment. So to presuppose that this isn't going on now, that families aren't being questioned sometimes in investigations, is just wrong. Now what we would be allowing in a world where we now have this scientific ability is the use of science as an investigative tool to solve some of these cases more quickly. I think, Barry, you posed, if this is only going to be such a small number, what's the point of all of this? I think you have to work with the victims to understand the point of all this, and with all due respect, I think that if this technology could clear even one wrongly convicted offender, you wouldn't be saying it's such a small number, and I would agree with you. If we can prevent, by solving something earlier, by going up to the Harris boys, because we had a partial match on one of those brothers, and we could solve that case sooner, and we could prevent that serial sodomist or serial rapist from committing more crimes, even once, I'd say you should be doing this. But the reality is you're going to obviously do it far more than once. All our matches have shown us that. And again, you tell the victims of these crimes that we have the scientific ability right now to give you a very reliable investigative lead. And that's all it is, an investigative lead. But we're not going to do it because we don't feel it's okay to bother the family members of the potential perpetrators. I don't think that makes any sense. I find that unfathomable. And the last thing I'd like to say is, I think, Barry, again, you said that this is so different than when we get a match and then we get a warrant and we go out and get the person in a match. That's incorrect, actually. When we get a match, we think of that as an investigative lead. A match is not always the answer to the person that did the crime. Even if it's a vaginal swab match, we take a photo array and we show it to the victim to make sure she doesn't go, oh yeah, that was my ex-boyfriend, or oh yeah, I forgot to tell you I had sex with him. And we have had that happen time and time again, and that was the end. We did that before we arrested someone. So we are using full matches as investigative leads, and that's all the police department that is trained to do that on full matches is going to do with partial matches. And again, I'm here to speak for the victims. If you haven't done this kind of work, you have no idea what they live with after they are sexually assaulted, how you take away their lives, their trust in people, their ability to walk down a street if it happened in a street, to be in their own apartments if it happened in their apartment, to be in the workplace. It is a devastating crime, and you have the scientific ability to prevent some of those crimes from happening to these people, and I urge you to do that. Thank you.
Just one point. Why can't this be done with a bill presented to the legislature, rather than change a rule and regulation, which I think doesn't comport with the existing law, which was drafted 15 years ago before partial matches was discovered?
Well, Your Honor, I'm not saying you couldn't do it with legislation, but I think the point is that it is legally allowable to do it by regulation. If you do it by regulation, you can do it sooner right now. All the time it might take to get that legislation passed, for every day that goes by, we will have more victims of these crimes because we don't allow it. And with all due respect to our legislature, and I'm obviously not a politician, the thought of getting something like this passed any time in the near future, I would say, it is going to be a fairly difficult thing given the history that we've seen in the last year. So I think if you can pass a regulation, and legally, I think you're on sound footing to do so, and you save the people that you will even save in the next couple of years it would take you to get a law through. I think that's something we should be doing with the science that's available.
Well, I think this is a totally false choice. I think this notion that the legislature will not act is something that's, at least the jury is out. I seem to recall that there was an accident on the highway several months ago, and a terrible thing happened. A woman took into her car children who, while she was under the influence of alcohol, and I think there was a bill passed within, 60 days?
quick.
Well, sir,
Pretty
it
quick.
actually took another accident on the West Side Highway with
No,
a
that's the
drunk
one I'm
woman who
talking
went.
about.
Well, then there was the one upstate on the Taconic. It took both accidents to get that passed. But what I'm saying is, and then they're calling it. Excuse me, I'm awful with names, but they're calling it the young woman who died in Manhattan's Law.
Right.
And my point is, I don't know why we always have to wait legislatively till we can put the name of some devastated victim on that law. Is that that's what we're going to wait for, till there's some poor, awful, devastated victim whose case never would have occurred. She never would have been raped if we had allowed a partial match to be released, and they would have gone to the Harris boys and found out it was one of the Harris boys. And what are we weighing? You're talking about weighing. Laws are about weighing, right? We're weighing the risk, as you put it, the invasion of privacy of the Harris boys or the Harris family against this devastation.
We're not talking about discussing today whether or not this should go to the legislature. We're talking, and I don't think there's any disagreement in this commission about that. What we're talking about is creating a possible legislative, a possible illegal action which might in fact infect some of the cases that you're supposedly concerned about. So it's a false choice to sit here and tell us that we're ignorant of this. I happen to represent people who are raped in prisons in the state of New York. So I'm well aware of the problems related to rape. Not as well as you, of course, and I can understand your concern. But we've been kicking this around now for the better part of a year. The law that bears the name of one of the victims on the West Side Highway was quickly put into action. I don't see that there'd be necessarily any major delay of the legislature being presented with this material in its present form or similar form and being presented with the opportunity to enhance your ability to capture criminals. I just don't see that as even possible. What I do see, though, is, and there are at least four of us, one of them being a judge who, as you well know, interpreted the penal law and the CPL and was the final word, saying, this is illegal. You can't do this. So why would you want to take this step, and the first step made to be one which is unlawful? Why not do it in a lawful manner, and maybe at that time you'd be able to do it even in a broader manner? Why take this limited step and the risk that the case that you prosecute may be overturned on appeal because we did something that we had no authority to do? Why do that?
Okay, but I don't think Lisa is really here to address the legal issues that we're addressing here in the commission.
But she's placing before this commission and on this record a false choice. Either it's not going to happen or you got to do it. And it's just a false choice. I don't accept it.
She did say that it was legal. Have you looked at Pataki versus Gallo?
I'm not here to debate
I know, you said-
legality,
no,
as Denise says. I have looked
but you
at the
did say
issue.
it.
I believe, Barry, that it is legal. We will have to agree to disagree on that issue. And the only other thing I want to say on this record is...
You're a lawyer. You're a lawyer and a district attorney. You
supposedly
can't
care.
come here and say...
Come on, Barry.
No, wait a
I
second.
can come here and say whatever Denise and the commission allows me to say,
You can say
Barry.
whatever
It
you
may not be
want,
what
but I'm
want to
saying you
hear, but I can
cannot
say it.
reasonably, you're not advancing this discussion or being reasonable when you said in your statement, and you just said now, you people are not doing something that's legal, and therefore you're impeding our ability to catch serial rapists.
Denise, this
that's
is all
not...
We were hearing Lisa, and I think Barry cut her off. I couldn't hear the ending of what she was trying to answer. And when people are talking over each other, it's very difficult for those of us in the remote locations to get an idea of what's going on.
I understand. Okay. Thank you very much, Lisa.
Thank you very
appreciate
much.
you being here.
The commission members, I appreciate your time.
No, wait a second. Can I just... She said 5 things directly addressing me, all right? And I'd just like to go right back and answer them because I'd like to clear the air here and let's have a reasoned discussion. First of all, you said you were here to represent the victims. I'm here to represent the victims, plenty of them of rape cases, okay? And I am the one that went to Giuliani and Safer and got all those unsolved rape kits tested in the state of New York when I had resistance from people, even in the New York County District Attorney's Office, to do it initially. So I really don't think it's adding anything to cast this whole issue in terms of who wants to solve these crimes and who doesn't. We all want to solve these crimes. In terms of proceeding against the Harris boys or conducting investigations, I have great respect for you and your office, and I have no doubt that you take some careful measures when deciding how to investigate a sensitive sexual assault case where you sit down and you go through exactly how we're going to do it, whether you need to get search warrants, who's going to talk to whom. These are very sensitive and difficult matters, particularly if you have information that may indicate that someone in the family is not really the father of an individual, and what impact that will have, because that's really quite devastating, and happens very, very frequently. All the geneticists in this room will tell you in terms of the way this technology proceeds. So the issue before us, and you just can't say, oh, well, it's legal. You know, we're sitting here, Judge McQuillan, Mr. Goldhart, myself, and Peter Neufeld, who have looked at this and said it's not even a close call. And so the issue with us is that what we would like to see are, as you go down this road of indirect associations and familial searching, because that's what it is, that we ought to have privacy protections in place so that responsible district attorneys such as yourself, if you're going to go down this road, can make, in my mind, what I'd like to see, an application to a judge that says we're not doing this in every case, only the serious cases, and we're going to be using the least intrusive investigative means, and we will have, rather than having the DNA subcommittee look at this, we'll have, frankly, lawyers, police, and investigators look at how that is going. Now, and you said you weren't a politician. Okay?
Definitely not.
So, all right, I don't want to claim to be a politician, but I do a lot of lobbying and I do a lot of work with this legislature and the federal government and a lot within the forensic community. And I think that this is a fight not worth picking. I think that if we had a group of prosecutors, defense lawyers, people that are familiar with forensics, and some, I won't speak for all civil libertarians, he would propose this kind of approach to this very, very sensitive and difficult issue of pursuing the partial match of familial searching so people could have some confidence that it's all being done in ways that are respectful of people's privacy, that are not engaging in any kind of untoward genetic surveillance or targeting any particular racial or ethnic group unduly. If it's done that way, then you could get a good consensus of it. Doing it this way, right, is going to only cause a lot of people to say, why is this commission usurping authority that the legislature did not give it? And you're asking for a big fight at the time that we want more money from our crime labs, and it's really for, not that any one case, solving any one case is a trivial matter, I quite agree, but you could be throwing out the forensic baby with the bathwater. It's better to do this sensibly than to do this unlawfully. And we couldn't have been clearer with it from the beginning, Denise, over a year and a half ago that I certainly was willing to work for this kind of legislation, and we sent you a letter from day one saying that there was a serious legal issue here. And we continue to say it, and if the commission, and I am really concerned, just even in the last thing, my biggest concern right now, even if you're going through with this, is what controls are in place as to how these investigations are being conducted and who's going to assess them and report on them. None. And
Okay.
the DNA subcommittee is not the people to
I'm going to
evaluate
thank you
that.
very much, Lisa,
You're welcome,
for being here. I am going to have to end this discussion and proceed to a vote.
So don't the other people
because
here, there are people that came here to talk about this.
who else came here to talk about it? Bill Pulaski. I mean, we don't have time. We've already heard and had a whole commission meeting hearing from other individuals from the New York City Civil Liberties Union. They have not made a request to speak at our meeting today. So I do...
Commissioner?
Yes.
I know I was afforded an opportunity to present to the entire commission. If I could make a couple of remarks.
No, you did appear at our commission meeting to speak at the commission
That's what
meeting.
I said.
Yes.
And
Okay.
so I'm saying I'm acknowledging that I had that opportunity.
Oh, okay.
And I'm asking if I can make a couple of related comments at this juncture.
Well, you certainly could, but we have to keep it at about 5 minutes if the commissioners agree. We could do that, and then we're going to have to proceed because we have very important information that we're going to have to deal with from the Inspector General, who's been patient sitting in our meeting.
I'm asking only for a few minutes.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay.
For those who don't know me, my name is Robert Perry, and I'm the legislative director with the New York Civil Liberties Union. I want to make sure...
Yes, do you want to have a seat, please, Mr. Perry?
I want to make only a couple of points, and they have been addressed or implicated by the discussion proceeding, so I won't go into great detail, but I would like to get them on the record. The first point being, and I've elaborated on most of these arguments in the presentation I made to you previously, but the first point, and I think it's important for us to be able to say this on the record, is that procedure, rules, implicate substantive law, substantive policy. And it's our view that this rulemaking procedure does directly implicate lawmaking, and that this is, in fact, a lawmaking undertaking that the Commission is engaged in. For that reason, and for the reasons stated on the record already this morning, legislative debate and review, we believe, is essential, and it's a prerequisite for advancing this proposal. Just secondly, as a practical matter, and this was raised by Barry Scheck, I raised it when I presented before the Commission. The new rules, but I hadn't seen these rules when I did present before you. The new rules as to the follow-up investigation, that's my term for it, whatever the subsequent investigatory procedure is based on the indirect match, whatever that procedure is, it essentially says to law enforcement, based on my reading of these rules, that the discretion is yours as to the follow-up investigation. Essentially, use your investigative imagination. There is no constraint as to privacy due process, formal or informal. And I think the potential for abuse of due process and privacy is enormous. The debate and back and forth was quite interesting, and I've heard some of the sidebar comments from prosecutors and others, and their arguments clearly have merit. But many of them were predicated upon an assumption, and I hear this often in my debates with prosecutors, as if the criminal justice system is infallible, that it operates typically in an efficient manner, absent of negligence, error, fraud, prosecutorial abuse, as if those things do not occur, and of course they do. And in light of the open-ended nature of the follow-up investigative process that's allowed by this proposal, it seems to us inevitable there's going to be a likelihood, a foreseeable probability of significant problems, breaches of fundamental rights and due process. And finally, to Barry's last point, I'm in no position now to take a position for the NYCLU regarding what might be an appropriate legislative enactment. But I can say, if this commission, including the 4 members that I now understand are dissenting from this position, this proposal, were to unanimously, or with some degree of consensus, make a legislative proposal that would get to the very real problem the commission is trying to address through this partial match or indirect match policy, I suspect you would find fairly swift legislative action. And I think that's the appropriate course of action. And I'll leave my comments there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Perry, and thank you. You presented at length to the Commission previously. I know you feel very deeply about this, so I appreciate you being here. I also do want to mention in your packet you do have the letter that came from the DNA subcommittee that only deals with the technical and scientific part of the implementation plan and regulation, but is still very important for you to be aware of, and that they did feel that this was in conformance with their recommendations to this commission. So that being said, I would move to approve the proposed amendments to the rules and regulations and implementation plan as provided in the documents dated November 10th, 2009 and November 25th, 2009 as recommended by the DNA subcommittee, or request a motion to that effect. I want to say also, just so you're clear, that the next step in the process would be that if this commission were to adopt the regulations and implementation plan, that it would go back to the DNA subcommittee for a binding recommendation. It would come back to this committee to be forwarded to Gore for publication and public comment. So this is one of the steps in a multi-step process that has been taking place over a period of time before those regulations and implementation plan would be finally approved. Is there a motion to approve the proposed amendments to the rules and regulations?
One point of information about those procedures. Do you have authority to request an opinion from the Attorney General as to the legality of this?
I don't think it's necessary to ask for an opinion from the Attorney General, Barry.
Well,
so
I have to say, the letter that you sent back to us citing the case of Pataki versus Gallo.
Gallo versus Pataki.
Gallo versus Pataki as authorization for this change, whereby you can disclose not the person whose profile matches a crime scene sample, but an indirect association, which plainly, the whole point of it is to target relatives, right? Pataki versus Gallo has to do with this commission issuing rules that permit the collection of DNA from a person who is giving it as a condition of parole. There is dicta in there saying that the commissioner has wide discretion in the area of making rules and regulations with respect to the collection, but it doesn't go, that doesn't even approach this. And I really think that it, you know, I understand, Commissioner O'Donnell, that you feel strongly about this, and you keep on talking in your letter about that it would be morally repugnant and irresponsible to prevent the people from the lab to disclose this information so serious cases could be solved. And we all share that urgency and been talking about this for a year and a half. But as far as a legal matter is concerned, to cite that case in light of the letters and the statements made by Judge McQuillan as authorizing this is irresponsible, and I mean that with respect. I mean, as a legal matter, it is lawless.
Okay,
and so
I think you're
would
beyond
strongly
the point
suggest.
of information,
no,
Barry.
no, I would make this
We're back
proposal
to
before. I would make this proposal to address our concerns, and I would urge you to seek an opinion letter from the Attorney General as to whether or not this is lawful.
All right, thank you.
Well, that's a motion.
Did
That's a
put a
motion.
motion. Well, there is a motion on the table already to approve the amendment.
Well, then I'll offer an amendment. My amendment is that, subject to an opinion from the Attorney General, that this whole procedure, if it's voted to approve, should be subject to an opinion letter from the Attorney General that this is, that the Commission has the jurisdiction to do this. That's my amendment.
I'll second it.
All right, we have, I think we should separate them as an amendment to approve the changes to the bylaws and the plan. And a second amendment, I don't think that's an amendment to the original amendment. The second amendment that we seek an opinion from the Attorney General before we proceed. So let me take Barry's motion first, which has a second.
Not to proceed. Before this plan is implemented, that there should be an opinion from the Attorney General saying that the Commission has the jurisdiction to do this.
Okay, so that would be a second motion afterwards then. So you're saying after we approve this, what you're saying is then we go to the Attorney General?
No. I'm
You're
saying
saying before we vote on it.
I'm saying as a condition precedent to the implementation of this plan should be an opinion from the Attorney General that this is lawful.
Okay. So then let me take my first motion, and then we'll go to that motion. The first motion, is there a motion from anyone else? If not, I will make the motion. There's a motion.
To approve the changes to the regulations and implementation plan.
Okay. There is a motion. Is there a second to that motion?
Second.
Okay. Now, I am going to ask ask commissioners to raise their hand if they're voting in favor of that motion, so that we will be able to identify how many votes we have in favor, and then I will ask how many oppose or abstain. So then all those in favor of that motion, please raise your hand. That is 1, 2, 3. Kathy Corrado, I can't see yours. Is yours raised?
It's,
4,
my hand is raised.
5, 6, 7 in favor. All those opposed, raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4 opposed. So the motion is carried. There is a second motion that says that prior to implementation of the plan, that we seek a formal approval or opinion, from the Attorney General as to whether we have the authority to implement the plan. Is that it? Do you want to make the motion?
No, that is a conditioned precedent to the implementation of the plan, that the Attorney General issue an opinion saying that this is lawful. In other words, it can't be implemented if he says it isn't.
That's the motion.
That's the motion.
All right, and there is a second to the motion, Ira?
Yes.
All right. All those in favor of the motion?
Can we just have a brief discussion on it?
On that motion? Yes.
All right, I would like to...
Before you go into the second part, can we get a list of names for and against, because we could not tell on the raising of the hands?
Yes, Gina, can you read it? And yes.
Check.
Yeah, that? Okay.
Who did you have
For and against the original motion, I think.
against the original motion?
I have Commissioner Marina, Jim Murphy,
She doesn't have 4.
Big Jenny, Kathy Carruthers, Superintendent 4. There's somebody I'm missing.
I thought you meant against. We have...
Well, you give me the against, I'll take either one.
She has neither.
So 4. Read the names 4 and then read the names against.
Scheck, Goldhart, McQuillan, and Willie.
Against.
Against. And then Stagi, Corbett, Fitzpatrick, O'Donnell, Murphy, Jenny, Corrado.
4.
Thank you.
All right, discussion on the second motion.
Right. Couple of things. First of all, under the old business section, it was appropriately gathered the changes to Executive Law 49B. This is on page 1, and a reflection on that, brief reflection without going through it, indicates all the legislative changes that have taken place since the original passage of 49B, indicating that the legislature is responsive. And many of these, by the way, came from this commission. In other words, we would make a recommendation to various persons in the legislature, they would take it up, and there would be changes. So they often generated from this commission. I just want to point that out, that there have been numerous, and they've been gathered here. None of them are of the magnitude of the change that took place today, or is proposed today. Secondly, in 2004, there was a briefing book, basically for the commissioners, for the members of the commission, indicating the functions of the commission, the powers of the commission, what it could do and what it could not do, and its duties. None of these authorized. This was, and this is part of the operating standards of this commission. None of them authorized changing the basic definition of what did and what did not constitute material that could be disseminated from the data bank. So I offer this, again, in the hope that we can avoid the creation of a program which is fundamentally illegal from the outset. And I offer this in support of the motion to have the Attorney General at least take a look at this. I will further add that I've looked at the cases, and I know one of them was withdrawn, the case against Gord, from the putative lawful nature of this enactment. And I just want to say that none of them support what we did today. It is not a stretch. It's beyond comprehension that they would be offered in support. This is a perfectly good mission, and we are ruining it from the outset. That's my position. So at least let's do what any reasonable person would do in this situation and reach out to the Attorney General, who does rapidly provide opinions when requested on important matters, and certainly I think would not decline the opportunity to opine authoritatively on an issue of this magnitude.
Okay, thank you. All those in favor of the motion, please raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4. All those opposed to the motion, please raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. The motion is not carried.
Astonishing.
Oh, Denise, may I just
Yes,
inquire,
Judge.
may I assume that a vote against the initial proposal can mean, my vote only, solely because of the law issue? It's not in accord with the statutory law of New York, not on the merits.
All right, Judge, thank you. All right. I think we're going to have to, there's one more matter of old business that will, 2 matters we'll take up briefly, then we're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we'll get back and really go into executive session. So for those of you who are not available to stay, and the lab directors of matters that are referenced here are available to, or invited to stay, or those associated with the laboratories, but others will be excluded if our motion to go in executive session is carried. The next item has to do with an item that has been on the agenda for a long time, and it has to do with sequential unmasking. It's an important issue. Barry, I would suggest that perhaps we put it over till the next agenda item where we can discuss it in greater length if you have no objection, and we'll carry that over if we can. And the final is just a chart of external investigations that is not changed, but is a running chart that we keep of matters that have been referred to the Inspector General, and that's just in your information, or in your packet for information purposes only. At this point, I'd ask that we take a brief recess to use the facilities and then come back. And we have a very important agenda with the Inspector General, and I appreciate the fact that you all stayed and waited patiently for that. Thank you very much. Yes, would you mind closing it? So the first thing I have to do is to ask for a motion to go into executive session because all 3 of these matters do still involve, first of all, reports that have not been issued yet by the Inspector General, but equally important, disciplinary action or potential disciplinary action against certain employees. So can I have a motion to go into executive session? And thank you. Second?
Second.
Any objection? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
So we will go into executive session. I want to thank Inspector General Fish and other staff, members of the staff for sitting patiently to get to this point. I have to say that in addition to the New York State Police investigation that we had, these are clearly the most serious investigations that we've had to deal with as a commission. And without the services that you rendered, and I know you put so much time and effort into these investigations, we would have been at a loss as to how to proceed, and we would never, ever have had the kind of in-depth examination that you conducted. So on behalf of all the commissioners, I really want to thank you for the efforts that you put into these reports, as painful as they may be for us to have to confront. So I really appreciate it. I think it may be better if we take the first or the two shorter reports first, but I'll leave it to you.
Before you begin, I just want to say I was so happy to come here and renew a relationship with a former office mate of mine. Judge McClure and I shared an office a few years ago in 1959 with the State Investigation Commission when that commission did something and meant something. All right, and I also want to assure all of you that there is no familial relationship between the members of the staff.
So, Joe, has he ever been wrong on a point of law in your experience?
Only when he and I disagree.
Oh, that's good. So if you have any preference in terms of order, let us know. I think our preference would be to have the lab director from that lab come in here during their report, unless you prefer not to. Yes.
We need to make a motion to go into executive
We did
session.
make the motion.
Oh, we did, okay.
We have to go into executive session, so we have to ask you to turn it off. And, okay.